Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for the invitation to be here today. It's a very joyful and very humbling moment for me because the Thrive Scotland 2019 conference has been a great blessing to me, and also the Thrive network, the whole community help to encourage, challenge, and equip me over the years. So I do hope that at least some of the seeds that were planted in my life, I will get a chance to give back to the community. And with that, let me take you back, 10 years. When at that point I was in my mid-30s, I had the privilege of mentoring a group of female employees on career management. And during one of our early sessions, we discussed an article introducing something called the career triangle. And as you see on the triangle, it had three corners: job satisfaction, money, and lifestyle. And the core message in that article was simple. You could never have fully all three at once. Choosing one always meant a compromise, a trade-off. And while I really wanted to disagree with this statement, it felt painfully true to me at that time. Because over the years, with my husband, we relocated multiple times. And the number of those times was because of his career. And to me, each of those moves meant rebuilding confidence, networks, identity, reinventing myself professionally, and sometimes starting from scratch. So choosing relationship and accompanying my husband often came at a professional and personal cost. And later, while both of us were raising, two young children and working full time, life was chaotic. We were exhausted, sleep deprived, stressed. Both of our boys arrived into the world in a quite dramatic way and had some health problems early on. So balancing family as part of the lifestyle and work was a constant struggle. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, I was trying to hold everything together. And as you look at the triangle, you may wonder, well, where faith sat in the model. Well, it didn't. And it's not that faith didn't matter to me, quite the opposite. I prayed, I attended Bible studies, I went regularly to Mass. But if I'm honest, at that stage of my life, I viewed faith as something separate for the rest of life. There was if we can go back to the triangle, Gideon, for now. So there was the church life, and there was the home life. There was the sacred, and there was the ordinary. There were two parallel worlds, and yet something inside me started to kind of resist that division, because while I was trying to contribute financially to the family budget, which was an important aspiration to me, I was trying to pursue professional growth, care for my children, and somehow make space for the spiritual growth. I realized that I didn't want to choose. I wanted all of it. And so gradually in my mind, the triangle became a square. And then the square had four corners, the meaningful work, personal growth, family, and faith. And for a long time, this became my mental model for life. And I accepted that maybe I would not achieve 100% in every area. Maybe it would be 80%, and that was good enough for me. But I was determined to pursue all four aspects together, even if it meant constant juggling and stumbling. And I do remember canceling an important work meeting last minute because nursery called to say that my son was having an allergic reaction. I remember arriving at work, looking professional, feeling confident, only to discover baby food stains on my clothes. And many professionals, especially parents, know this feeling when you constantly try to switch roles. You're a leader, a professional, a parent, a spouse, a provider, a church member, a caregiver, and you become a master multitasker and a great logistician while quietly wondering, am I failing at all of these roles? Am I good enough? And so the squares gave me a model to orient my life, but definitely they didn't help me to balance my life, and the model didn't give me peace. Still, if I look back, I do think there was something good in this mental model and in the season of stumbling. because I think it reflected yearning for spiritual growth and seeking Jesus in the ordinary. It was my early longing for wholeness, I think. And I do think that the problem was actually not the model itself. The problem was that I was trying to hold all four of the corners together through my own strength. I thought maturity meant learning how to balance everything better, and eventually it became unsustainable. And I remember one evening during that time when I was desperately trying to settle my younger son so I could attend the Bible study on a Wednesday night. And he was crying, I was stressed, and eventually I just let him at home with my husband, feeling quite guilty and then quite emotionally drained. And I arrived late, flustered and quite hoping to quietly disappear in the room. But instead, the priest welcomed me, called me out and asked me to read the next exercise for the evening, which turned out to be Psalm 139. And it read as follows, "O Lord, you have examined my heart and know everything about me. You know when I sit down or stand up. You know my thoughts even when I'm far away. You see me when I travel and when I rest at home. You know everything I do." And halfway through the reading, I burst into tears. And it wasn't because it was emotional, the room was emotional, but because in that moment, I felt deeply seen by God. I felt He was saying, "I see you striving. I see your exhaustion. I see how hard this season is. And I see what's in your heart. And I delight in you seeking me." And it remains probably the most powerful moment of my spiritual life. Again, not because it was dramatic, but because it truly made me aware that we believe in a God who sees us, each of us, and shows up not only in the mountaintop moments, but in the ordinary, exhausting evenings. And what's also important is that the encounter happened through a community. Without the church, without the priest, without people creating space for me to encounter God that night, that moment might have not happened. And also around the same period, which was back in 2019, a friend invited me to the first Thrive Scotland conference. And just for the context, for 40 years, I grew up as a Catholic, and then I moved between Catholic churches and between different countries, churches in the different countries where we lived. But this was the first time or the first conference where I encountered Christians from different denominations, different traditions, openly worshiping together in a secular venue, professionals in business clothes, praying, singing, and talking about faith and work and in the same breath. And it was for the first time when I actually saw people naturally bringing faith into leadership, into business, into public life. Not leaving faith at the church, but carrying it into everyday decisions and relationships. And the encounter took me out of my ordinary, and something shifted in me. And I do remember being fascinated by it, but also slightly unsettled, because until then, as you may remember, I still carried, the subconscious belief that faith belonged mainly within the church space, while ambition, leadership and work belonged somewhere else. And at that conference, I heard one of the speakers, a close friend of Thrive Scotland, Ken Yankee, talk about what he called the tripping edge. The place where growth, responsibility, transition, and calling stretch us beyond certainty and beyond control. And at time takes us, this experience takes us out of our balance. And something about that image of the tripping edge, stayed with me deeply, because once again I felt seen. And then seen not only in my faith, but in the tension of simultaneously, carrying the different roles and the different aspirations of motherhood, leadership, ambition, exhaustions, and change. And also what stuck for me in that moment was that perhaps stumbling didn't mean failure or inadequacy. Perhaps some of the most transformative moments in our lives happen precisely at the edge, when we no longer feel fully in control. And that idea stayed with me so deeply that years later I named my leadership and coaching, career coaching business Trip to Grow. So it was a true inspiration. Because looking back, so much of my own growth happened not while feeling confident or settled, but when navigating uncertainty, discomfort, challenge, and dependence on God. And also, through the Thrive Scotland conference and later the City Table podcast that was hosted by Ken and his friend John Peterson, I was introduced to the idea of ecclesia, right? The church, not simply as a community gathered in a building we attend throughout the week, but as people of God living the faith together across every sphere of life, not the church on the go. And I still remember how mind-blowing the concept felt to me. The idea that we co-create church not only inside the church walls, but through the way we live, we lead, we work, we serve, we show up in world. And it really genuinely felt like an earthquake, for me, because until then my faith still occupied one corners, of my square, important, deeply important, but still in a compartment. And slowly I started to build a new understanding that faith was never meant to compete with work, with family, with ambition or growth, as one priority amongst others. But Christ was meant to sit at the center of it all. And that was a big shift, a profound shift for me, because before that, I thought I needed, better balance, better skills at balancing life. But through the wisdom of others, through life experience, prayer, reflection, God was teaching me that what I actually needed was integration. Not perfectly balanced compartments, not work over there and, church over there and the family here, but Christ at the center of how I lead, how I'm becoming a parent, how I build relationships, how I exercise my ambition, how I deal with uncertainty, how do I choose where to grow, how to deal with exhaustions or prevent it, and also how to navigate conflict. So rather than competing for meaning, all these parts of life, were becoming connected through Him. And perhaps all of them were good. And for a while I thought, I landed at the right model, I found my answer. And I thought this Christ-centered model was the destination. But in reality, I found that God was still teaching me. And then COVID came, and I think like many people, I came out of the season absolutely exhausted. And that season eventually pushed me towards major professional change. I moved into a part-time self-employment alongside a part-time HR role with a globally dispersed interdenominational Christian charity. And in many ways, it became a beautiful season. God provided through people, and again, I could have just a talk on that, how generous God has been. Through mentors, including those people from the Thrive community, through prayer, through business opportunities, through encouragement. But eventually, I found myself overextended, once more with 2 jobs, 2 kids, a 3-year master's degree program, volunteering at 2 Christian organizations. And this time, I sensed God saying very clearly to me, this is no longer healthy. This is not what I want for you. And even good things can become too much. And I think as many capable, passionate Christians, many capable, passionate Christians struggle with that because we are often very good at saying yes. But as I'm finding, spiritual maturity also requires learning when to stop, when to rest, when to let go, and when to trust God enough not to carry everything by ourselves. And it was probably one of those kind of most spiritually testing seasons of my life as well, because I felt overextended, as mentioned, feeling I belonged everywhere and nowhere at all. I felt, fruitful in some places and totally misunderstood or rejected in others. And at times I felt emotionally and spiritually and professionally kind of stuck. And someone was praying for me at that time, and described an image of me being stuck, in deep mud and struggling to move forward. And so it was a very joyful season, but also a very fruitful season, but also a very lonely and sometimes very desperate season at times. But through persistent prayer, not just individual, but communal, worship and prayer, that stuckness, slowly began to lift, and it did take quite a bit of time. But the harder the moment was, the bigger the challenge, the stronger was my sense that God was working along me, through those difficult moments. And I began to realize that, despite my me being disgruntled with what was happening around me, God was deepening something, in me through the season, increasing my empathy, my humility, my love for others, and dependence on Him. And at that season, really, it was only when I finally let go of striving, when I stopped trying to force outcomes, when I welcomed obedience, and I allowed God to lead, that things started to shift profoundly. And once again, I was reminded that I could trust God, I could trust Him to be faithful, and that He was already holding, the things that I was desperately trying to carry myself. And that lesson of trust, of faithfulness, continues. Last year, after 11 years in Scotland, we relocated to the Netherlands, which means another season of rebuilding, of change, new place, new schools, new language, new work, new church environment, new friendships, and building new connections. And once again, God has been very, very faithful, very, very gracious and generous. But it's been a challenging season as well, especially for our children. But also for myself, I found myself moving from a well-established, Catholic church in Aberdeen, and then later growing Pentecostal church that became home. And both of them equipped me, supported me, challenged me. I moved into a very different ecosystem here in Netherlands. Suddenly, instead of belonging to one rooted community, I found myself moving between different church expressions and communities, evangelical, Catholic, Dutch-speaking, Polish-speaking, online, in person. And kind of to add to that paradox, partially through the encouragement of my non-believing husband, I also found myself helping with Alpha, the local Catholic church in our neighborhood, and the course is entirely in Dutch, right? And I'm just learning the language. So honestly, that whole setup at times feel almost absurd, and judging by some of the expressions around me, I suspect others occasionally, think that too. Where I came from, like why I'm joining this group. And honestly, I've been struggling with that, and I began wrestling with God. I could not understand why would God uproot me, would lead me into something that felt so fragmented, so unfamiliar, and in a way, difficult to enter. And there were moments where I genuinely questioned, why did we move? Did I discern it incorrectly? Was it a mistake? But somewhere within that discomfort, I began sensing that perhaps God was intentional, again, and where I thought I already found, my mental model to orient myself. Just the context didn't fit into that model, so there was something wrong with the context. He seemed to widen the perspective again, and as I voiced my frustrations and confusion to God, once again, He seems to respond through people, conversations and small moments that slowly shifted my perspective. And I began to realize how much time sometimes as Christians, we spend focusing on what's different and unfamiliar, curious, uncomfortable, rather than what binds us together and, how we can learn from each other, which I think we had some nice, very helpful, practical testimonies and sharing in earlier sessions today. Because, despite of our differences, the different language, tradition, style, way in which we express our faith, we remain part of one church, with different branches we had to happen to join or attend, but still of one church, with one priest, whose name is Jesus. And kind of what this local ecosystem of my small churches community now in Netherlands is teaching me is that church often reveals its deepest strength, not through scale, through structure or resources or certainty, but faithfulness, through people praying together, through small churches collaborating despite limited resources, through believers encouraging one another across traditions like here today. So this is not maybe perfect at times, but it is faithful. And perhaps that is part of fruitfulness. Because sometimes we can only pray together. Sometimes we can only encourage one another, and sometimes we can simply show up and make ourselves available to God. And perhaps those ordinary, small acts of faithfulness are more powerful than we realize. So I guess in terms of my journey, that perhaps the newest lesson that God is teaching me is that for years the question for me was, how do I prioritize? How do I choose? How do I balance? Then it became, how do I hold everything together? Later it became, how do I keep Christ at the center? And then recently, I think I'm starting to ask myself the question, Lord, where are you already at work and around me in my neighborhood of birth, as we say in Dutch, and how can I faithfully participate? And perhaps that's the newest season in teaching for me. So I guess I'm beginning to see life less as separate compartments, to be managed, to be juggled, and more as interconnected circles through which God moves and works through us. And I guess my mental model once again evolves. So I guess to sum up, today I no longer believe fruitfulness comes from perfectly balancing every area, and many of us try to hold everything for years through our own effort, just to discover how fragile that balance can be. So the invitation is perhaps slightly different, maybe not balance, but Christ-centeredness, not compartmentalization, but integration. Not control, but trust and obedience, and not standing still, but being willing to explore, to stumble and be pruned along the way, and not self-sufficiency, but the courage to depend on God and one another, because life will change, we'll keep changing, children grow, careers shift, relationships evolve, the branches of the one church we belong to change as well, and we change. And then sooner or later, we will find ourselves again on the tripping edge, and where we will feel out of control. But perhaps those are the places where God is doing His deepest work in us and through us. And perhaps it's precisely at the edge of our own strength, when we are out of our balance, that we discover what was true all along, that God never asked us to carry it alone. And I guess if we keep orienting our life towards God, He will help us discern what to say yes to, what to say no to, what to explore, when to explore, when to prune. Yes, I think that fruitfulness is not born from us having everything in control, but remaining rooted in Christ, keep coming to the center. He's being attentive to His leading, and willing to join Him in the work He's already doing around us. So thank you for the space to share it with you.
Oh, thank you so much, Diana. This is the second time I'm being privileged to listen to you, and it's really, really amazing. Thank you so much. It's so amazing to hear real stories from real people in faith, navigating life, career, and family needs. And I love how you ended the session saying it's about knowing, it's about it's about the courage to understand that everything depends on God. That is really, really beautiful. Again, just to reiterate, if anyone on this call is going through a very concerning moment, the scripture she shared earlier is something that really touched me. Psalm 139, verse 1. It says, "Oh Lord, you have examined my heart and you know everything about me." That's a very powerful scripture. If you study that, it will help you regain confidence in what God is doing in and through you. We'll move on to the question and answer sessions. I don't know if we'll have some questions so far, Twinkle. Yes, a few questions. Are you going to read them out? Should I just read them out?
I can read it. Yes, I was just reflecting.
Okay.
So I'm reading that. Thank you for the insight. Work-life balance equals old school for Christians. Work-life church faith is the norm. Any practical tips how to prioritize? I would. To me, it's you need to find a space. You need to find a space, headspace, and then real space, quiet space to take a step back and pray. So I would say pray, stay attentive. A lot of guidance comes to me through other people. So be open to listen to others. It's like, it was amazing to me that God didn't share everything with St. Paul straight away. He sent him to the community and asked him to gain that wisdom through community. So listen and then decide. And then see, what are the fruit? Is what you're doing engaging and bringing joy, light, or is it becoming a drain and heavy weight and burden? So yeah, I'd say pray, which includes reading the Bible, reach out to others, take time to stop, reflect with a critical eye of what fruit is your actions are bringing.
Okay. Yeah.
When we decide it's all too much, especially serving at church, how do you determine if it's even a tinge of laziness versus just needing rest? I think sometimes it is a process, but at times you just may be brutal. You just say, no, I need to trim multiple branches to get more space to get this fresh sensing of where is God leading me. So again, I just can speak on my behalf. Sometimes it takes time to figure it out, and sometimes you just need to say, well, there's 10 things on my plate, and all of them are in a way good, but where is God leading me? Where is still my heart, my skills, my passion, and what are the 3-5 that I need to lead, and then maybe take myself back. So sometimes you need to be quite brutal with the pruning to get that head space and heart space to discern.
Amazing. I think that'll be all for the Q&A session. Thank you again. Thank you, Diana. It's been an amazing session. Thank you for all you bring to the body of Christ. God bless you.